another session in English. Welcome to the session European Democracy versus National Democracy. We will discuss in this panel if the European institutions are democratic or not. European history is living critical times. After Brexit, the sentiment of an unstable European Union is becoming stronger and stronger. Most surveys show that European citizens do not trust the EU anymore. In times where the European Commission needs to show strength, just last week a European Commissioner left her post and made a last-minute entry to the race to become Secretary General of the UN. Now that she lost, she is back at her job in Brussels. Last Sunday in Hungary, even if a low turnout invalidated a referendum against EU refugees quotas, Prime Minister Viktor Orban declared, "There are 3.3 million people in Hungary who decided that they won't allow anyone else to decide on the matter of settlement and migrants." This was clearly a message to Brussels as well. Today the question seems to be, are we heading to a disintegration of the European Union or not? I would like to present my main speakers, Mrs. Vivien Schmidt, a Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration, Professor of International Relations in the Pardee School and of Political Science at Boston University, where she is also founding director of the Boston's University Center for the Study of Europe. Her current work focuses on the problems for democratic legitimacy resulting from the Eurozone crisis. She will also soon publish a book called Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone, published by Oxford University Press. Mr. Wolfgang Streeck. He's a social scientist. He is professor and director emeritus at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne, Germany. He was also professor of sociology and industrial relations at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His current research interests are crisis and institutional change in the political economy of contemporary capitalism. In this session, we will focus on the legitimacy of the EU, on its credibility, and finally, we will try to understand what are the consequences and solutions for the future. Professor Vivien Schmidt, you have said recently that European democracy is in a parlous state. But you also added that the British vote for exit from the European Union has highlighted deep-seated problems with democracy at both the EU and national levels. But it would be a mistake to think that this means the EU is undemocratic. Could you elaborate, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I think it's wrong to say the EU is undemocratic, but you cannot say that the EU is a democracy. The EU is made up, however, of member state democracies. It operates by democratic principles, and it's gained legitimacy over time, policy area by policy area, as member states, as governments have accepted it explicitly. You can start with single market, euro, etc., Schengen. And that has been accepted implicitly by citizens, have accepted the authority of the EU, except if only by complying with all the rules. So I think it's important to see that the EU is not democracy per se, but it has the elements of democratic legitimacy. But we need to dig deeper on what do we mean by legitimacy. And there you can think of three kinds of legitimizing mechanisms in most democracies. One is performance, the effectiveness of the policies, so that you have good outcomes. Two is about politics. It's about political representation. It's about government responsiveness to the citizens. And three is about the procedures. It's about the processes, that they're fair, they're transparent, they're accountable, they're inclusive and open. And so we need to think about these three kinds of legitimizing mechanisms when we ask, not simply is the EU democratic, but is it legitimate? And I think that's key. And if you look initially over in the early years of the EU until relatively recently, on all three dimensions, the EU appeared to be legitimate. As it was building the single market, Schengen, the euro, I think there was a sort of a tacit assumption that all of this was legitimate. But what we saw even before the major crises, that increasingly we see EU-level performance ended up undermining legitimacy. The single market was producing losers and not just winners. The euro structure was creating imbalances and increasing divergence, even though the assumption was it would produce convergence. And the Schengen area did not control the flow of immigration, so much so that even in the early 2000s, we saw the rise of extremist parties of various kinds. I think I don't dare call them populist, or maybe I do. Given the earlier discussion, but basically we already saw problems, and also in terms of leadership, national politicians were engaged in blame shifting for unpopular policies. Oh, Brussels made me do that, and when they were actually good policies that came from Brussels, I did it, say the politicians. So very great problems for EU legitimacy on a range of levels in performance, but also in terms of politics. And then we get the perfect storm of crises beginning in 2008. We get the financial crisis followed by the Eurozone crisis. We get the refugee crisis, immigration, terrorism. We get Brexit. And so the questions are, is this the beginning of disintegration? There's no doubt that there are serious problems here, but is it disintegration? We'll talk about that later. I just want to sort of take us back to the legitimacy problems. What we do see is that the EU has continued to integrate. More and more decisions are made at the EU level and taken away from the national level. That's a serious problem in terms of politics, because politics, the political side of these three mechanisms, is largely at the national level, whereas performance, responsibility for policies, and processes are largely at the EU level. And this has created a massive tension between EU and national level. So much so that if we could think about the EU level as policy without politics, and the national level as politics without policy. And citizens feel that they have no more say, that there's politics, but they have no impact on policy, where the decisions are made at the EU level that are more and more remote. So if we ask, is there a problem of democracy? Certainly to some extent at the EU level, but I would argue the problem of democracy is massively at the national level. And that one needs to, if one thinks about how do you reform the EU, how do you go forward, it's how do you rebuild democracy at the national level, even as you try to build more legitimacy at the EU level.
Professor Wolfgang Streeck, after Brexit, you wrote, "Discontent is widespread. In many other European countries, a similar referendum would have had a similar result. Clearly, supranational superstate building has failed as a political program." Could you explain, Professor?
Yeah, I have very little to add to what Vivien said. I'm basically in full agreement with her main points. Maybe one could elaborate on a few issues. For example, traditionally, it was claimed that the democratic legitimacy of the European Union depends on its performance, so-called output legitimacy. Now, if we look at the output in the last 10, 15 years, what we see is declining growth all over the place, declining employment, increasing unemployment, and the opposite of convergence, namely divergence in economic performance, and especially if you take Northern Europe and Southern Europe. The Italian economy today, which is going to be the next big problem, if you take a vote in Italy now, there is a solid majority against the euro. Not necessarily against the European Union. European Union is now sort of only the less integrated part of it. Most integrated is the monetary union. And you look at Italy, you have 12% unemployment, you have an employment rate of 65%. The economy performs at a level of 6% below what it was in 2008, before the crisis. And then you look at Germany with an unemployment rate of 4.5% or 5%, an employment rate of 75%, and an economy that is now 6 or 7% above the 2008 level. This is what you call divergence and not convergence. And the idea was that this should, that the monetary union should bring the European peoples to the same plane. Yeah. It's a disaster. To me, it's a disaster. Usually I'm known as somebody who is a critic of the European integration process, but I'm not a critic. I'm just asking questions. For example, listening to Vivien, my question would be, what the hell is this beast like? What is it? What is the European Union? Is it an international organization of sovereign states governed by international law? Or is it a superstate that is beginning to become a hierarchically structured system? Now, that's an important question, because in this intermediary position where this thing is now you have the worst of both worlds. You have an international regime that is not democratic, cannot be democratic because it's not a state. And at the same time, that regime imposes more and more restrictions, requirements, obligations on the democratic states that belong to it, deeply intervening into their political process, without any accountability. Now, for example, the European Union is dictating to its members what sort of budget they are supposed to have. Regardless of which party wins the next election, they have to stick to the budgetary guidelines. The Greeks have even been told that they have to fire 25,000 public employees. Now, if this is not an intervention into the democratic sovereignty of a country, I don't know what it is. So as a result, of course, people get furious. And as Vivien says, the national politicians now have this beautiful opportunity to complain that Brussels has made us do it, and we are not to blame, we are not accountable. But as a result, of course, people get pissed off with democracy, and they think democracy is a strange thing. We are supposed to vote and to make up our minds, but what happens has nothing to do with it. In the end, someone in Brussels or in Berlin dictates what happens. It's a disaster. To me, it's a disaster. And since I will say a few more bad words about this wonderful construction, let me say that in the 1980s, I was an active participant, supporter of the European integration process of the first Delors committee. I collaborated on the report on the internal market, where in the end the European bureaucracy decided that this report should predict a growth rate of 4% for all countries in the European internal market for the next 20 years, and full employment and all of these things. And I asked Cecchini, who was the chair of this committee, where in the hell he finds this data in what we had produced. And he said, well, you know, basically said, shut up, you're the expert, and I'm the politician. And in the end, I decide what this report is to mean. I was very young then, so I didn't dare. But this, I remember this very vividly. This sort of huge amount of promises. Also, the social dimension under Delors was promised at the time when he changed tack completely to a supply-side economic policy. Yeah, this came together. So I'm really disenchanted with this project, and I very much sympathize with the Brits who decided that they didn't want to continue with this. And my slight hope is that the British exit will bring some sense to people in Brussels and in Berlin and in Paris, so that they begin to think about what they have created, the disaster that they have created. But my view, but I'm without illusion on politicians. I don't think they learn something from it.
Wow, after this really... after this pessimistic view, do you really think, Professor Vivien Schmidt, that the European institutions dictate on member states their policies?
Well, it's interesting. Before I answer, or do they dictate, I'd like to get back to what Wolfgang said. And unfortunately, much of what you said is true. It's just that I don't know that Brexit or Grexit or exit of all the member states one by one is actually a sensible idea. I don't think it's necessarily best for Europe, but I don't think that where the EU now is very good for Europe either. I mean, there are all sorts of geopolitical, geostrategic challenges that Europe faces as a large region. They need to work together to confront these. There are the challenges of globalization as well. Do we want continued neoliberal globalization, as we heard in the previous panel, criticisms of it, or is there some way to moderate this? And so I think for that you need the EU. But what is the EU? A supranational treaty organization, a superstate? I don't think so. I have in the past called it a region state. No one, unfortunately, has picked up on this.
Maybe good reason.
Possibly. But it's certainly an unsteady state, whatever it is. But I mean, what you can see is there are different degrees of integration, and this is a particular entity that has both nation-state members that have come together. So what have they done? Back to the institutions, are things imposing? I think what we need to do is look at the moment of crisis and what happened. And what you saw was a massive increase in intergovernmentalism, meaning that the council, the member state leaders in the council decided. But at the same time, you've also had an increase in supranationalism, meaning increasing powers of monitoring, etc., and policy responsibility to the European Central Bank, to the Commission, at the same time that the European Parliament, well, it's never been a totally representative body or fully representative at that, and it's been gaining slight bits of power, but not tremendous. So there is something we'd call a new EU governance. But within this context, given in particular the increase in intergovernmentalism, what you've had is the council decides, and who in the council decides. I like to call this, if the austerity and structural reform policies can be called one size fits one, that obviously doesn't work for many member states, then in the council we could call it one size fits one, and you can guess who the one is. So unfortunately, Germany has had overwhelming power in the council. There are those people who would call it a dictatorship, Germany essentially deciding what the rules are, but there's a complication to this, because Germany can say, I want this, but other people have to agree. And so I would also blame other member state leaders for joining the bandwagon. Everyone, after all, said, yes, we want these strict rules. We want austerity and structural reform. Look at the difference in the U.S. The U.S. did not impose that kind of austerity, and the U.S. has been growing. So these are bad rules, and it was imposed all by the member states. So you could say, rather than a dictatorship, the council is a deliberative public body. And what did it deliberate? It deliberated on rules that don't work. But there is one silver lining to this, this what I call governing by the rules and ruling by the numbers. This takes us back to legitimacy. Initially, the governing by rules and ruling by numbers was an assumption that if you double down on the rules, if you reinforce the processes, that you'll have good performance. And it doesn't matter that the politics isn't there, that people aren't involved, that because it's going to work. And then, of course, it doesn't work. The EU economy continues to slow, not to grow, and Southern Europe is a disaster. But what we find is that slowly but surely there's a recognition by all the EU institutions, so not just the Council, but in particular the European Central Bank and the Commission, that this isn't working. And in order to be truly legitimate, these things have to work. And so what you've seen is a change in the processes. This is what I call reinterpreting the rules by stealth. Why by stealth? Well, because you can't change the rules given the unanimity rule, given that there's always going to be one or two or many member states that say we want to keep austerity and structural reform, in particular in the North. What we've seen happen is that the reinterpretation of the rules by stealth means that all EU institutional leaders say we're holding to the rules, strict austerity, structural reform, at the same time that slowly but surely they've been increasing flexibility. Derogations to the rules, slower down in terms of deficit reduction for Italy and France. And again, for Italy and France. Spain, the calculation of the numbers don't work, we'll let you give us the way to recalculate the structural deficit. In Portugal and Spain recently, okay, we know you've really disobeyed completely, haven't followed the rules, but no sanctions. So, I mean, this makes things work better, but the problem is these are still suboptimal rules, and they're illegitimate. They're seen as illegitimate. No one's telling the truth. I mean, this is also the Council, where they're also talking about growth, flexibility, investment, even though they say rules. Problem.
Professor Streeck, Vivien Schmidt just mentioned the influence of Germany in the European Union. You are German and living in Germany. Do you agree that Germany has too much influence in the other member states?
Let me first say something on what Vivien just said. Vivien, I always admire the capacity to see the silver lining in the middle of the night. That's a humanly very sympathetic sort of thing, but if it becomes the mainstream of a research tradition, namely on European integration, I get suspicious. And these trends that I've described are now very old. The sort of the turning of the European Union into a liberalization machine, and the machine to discipline national politics has begun roughly in the mid-1990s, and it has continued throughout. We're now 20 years later, and it's deeply embedded in the structure, in the DNA of the European Union, through the court, through the central bank, and so on. So yes, you can say it could be different, but I'm a sort of social scientist. If I see something, if I see a train moving at 100 kilometers per hour into the railway station, I say this is an accident waiting to happen. Yeah? If I look at the Italian situation today, I say this is an accident waiting to happen. And I don't see anything that could prevent this accident from happening. Why? Because the nice things that you mentioned, and I'm sure you're right, they exist. In my view, and again, I have this sort of slightly brutal view of things. In my view, they are designed to keep Europe-friendly governments in power and nothing else. So now Merkel does her best to help Renzi over the referendum in December and over the elections a year later. That's her main concern. The concern is not the situation of Italian young people who are unemployed at 50%. This is not the problem. If that was the problem, you have to do something very, very different. Namely, in my view, allow the Italian economy or the Italian state, and for that matter the Portuguese state and the Mediterranean, to return to some kind of monetary policy sovereignty. That's the crucial point. You cannot, there's no example in the history of economics that you can adjust a country just by internal devaluation to make it competitive with a country, with a hard currency country like Germany. It is impossible. It never works. It cannot work. And therefore, I am completely grateful to organizations like Cinque Stelle, like Podemos, the so-called badly reputed populists, who do something very important. And I want to underline this, also going back to the discussion of the last session. You see, we now live in a world in which people like Larry Summers, the sort of the big guy of the capitalist machine room, yeah? And someone like Larry Summers says, oh, we have a secular stagnation. We don't really know where it comes from. We don't know how we get out of it, but what we do know is anything can happen anytime. Yeah? That's basically the wisdom of those that control our economy. What do? They listen to Goldman Sachs, Hillary Clinton, right, is an old friend of the House. They listen to these people and think, well, how can we make them a little less pissed off with our economies? What can we do for them? So I think we need to have some counterbalance to this. These people must be forced to listen not just to the Goldmans, but also to the little guy. And when do they listen to the little guy? When the little guy is in the street and he gets angry. He or she gets angry, very angry. We do not have to expect from them that they knew a blueprint how to pull current capitalism out of its demise. They don't have that blueprint, but the others don't have it either. So we need some more unrest on this front. And this is, I think, what I really like about this. Now, you're asking about Germany. See, I am a German European in the sense that I'm a German, but I like to live in a Europe in which, if you go to some other country and you're from Germany, people say, oh yes, there are bad Germans, there are good Germans, probably he's a good German, and it's okay. If I live in a Germany where the German government dictates to the rest of Europe what they have to do in economic terms, and what they have to go through, and how many people they have to make unemployed, and how they have to reform their labor markets, and how they have to support the German export economy by buying their products, and at the same time getting more and more impoverished. If this is what Germany is about, I'm an anti-German European. Yeah? I'm known in Germany for this. I write articles in the press where I predict that if Germany continues to insist on this sort of policy regime, where other countries have unfortunately given up their monetary sovereignty, and we dictate to them a hard currency regime under which they cannot live, not to mention prosper, then tensions in Europe will become so bad that everything that we have built up after the war, in the 30 years or 40 years after the war, in terms of mutual goodwill among the European peoples, will be gone. It will disappear. Vivien said there are also other countries, and I could not agree more. Because if you want to look at this in a more sort of differentiated way, then you have to ask the question, why in the world did the French and the Italians sort of buy into the German monetary system at a time when even the Germans didn't want to share it with the rest of Europe? Because the euro is not a German invention. It's a French Delors and later Italian invention. In the case of Italy, it is relatively easy to describe. The Italian political elite, after the breakdown of the Italian party system under the Mani Pulite, the Italian political elite wanted to buy in from the outside a hard currency to discipline their own society, to break up the rest of the communist unions, to push the left out of the political class. How did they want to do it? by sort of buying in a constraint with which they could tell their people, we have to scrap the Statuto di Lavoratori. Unfortunately, we have to scrap it, but these bad Germans and the euro, they demand that we do it. Look at the French, Mitterrand. Mitterrand wanted to get rid of the communists and the communist trade unions. And then after the Keynesian reflation in the early 1980s, he thought, my God, this doesn't help, so I need to turn 180 degrees around. How can I do this? With a European currency run by the Germans so that we have a strong economy. And these games have backfired in an unbelievable way. The French can't breathe under this regime anymore, the Italians even less. But the political elites of these countries are too cowardly to admit that this was a bad mistake. And now what they do is they try to live from election to election, watching their own economies deteriorate, watching right-wing parties grow, and asking the European Central Bank for the little things that you just mentioned, like allow them a 1% more deficit next year so that Renzi can get re-elected. This will not help the Italian people. It will maybe help Renzi, but I think only for a short time. I think after Renzi there will be Cinque Stelle. And then it gets really interesting.
So if I could just respond, and I am in total agreement with Wolfgang on just about everything except for how do we get out of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that disintegration is the answer. My view is that there has to be some way to get to incremental change. Mm-hmm. And I'll get to there in a minute. But first, I just want to reinforce what Wolfgang was saying about what is not just a neoliberal project, but an ordoliberal project. Ordoliberalism is neoliberalism with rules. It's particularly German. But I think it also helps explain why Germany in particular has followed this path. The assumption that stability is the answer to everything, and in a kind of neoliberal policy. And it has worked to some extent for Germany, so much so that Germany is an export massive export surplus producing country, but it's ultimately a disaster for everyone else, including German workers. But regardless of that, if we think about the French, the problem with Hollande is he basically, I mean, the French actually don't like this kind of policy. They'd like to change it, but Hollande has it in his head that in order to be able to change the economic policy, we have to have credibility. In order to have credibility, we have to follow the rules. But if you follow the rules, France will never grow again, because these rules don't work for France, they don't work for Italy, they don't work for Portugal and Spain. These are different varieties of capitalism, and there's a massive problem in assuming that one size fits all works, in particular in the one size fits none structure of the euro, which also doesn't work, which causes, as Wolfgang said, tremendous divergence rather than convergence. But the question is then, how do we get out of this? One way is to assume that it's a train going into the station that's going to crash at 100 miles an hour, 100 kilometers an hour, which is Wolfgang's assumption, which may very well be the case. I'm suggesting that it may very well be that the conductor is beginning to say, Commission, oh my goodness, I better start putting the brakes on now. Maybe I need to find new brake pads. Maybe I actually need to find a way to switch direction. You know, maybe there's a, and so what I see going on in these little bits and pieces is an attempt to find ways out of this. So one way is what you're seeing discussed in the think tanks, that the Commission is taking more and more seriously, have an unemployment insurance fund, find ways to decrease inequalities. But I mean, these are minor things, I suppose, but there are a whole range of ways in which they're thinking about positive ways for integration. But actually, I would argue, and this actually comes back to what Wolfgang was saying, that what one needs to do is one can keep what is an actual amazing coordination structure but change the ideas infusing it, and instead also of having this a top-down structure, hierarchical control, neoliberal ideas about how you're supposed to engage in structural reform, smash the unions first, etc. Yeah. And yes, we need to deal with the product markets. Oh, but they're more complicated. So you actually don't address the serious problems. But what needs to be done is actually to renationalize economic policy, meaning decentralize, meaning give back to the national level control over their budgets and finances, at which point you could then say, okay, we can have politics back again. There can be a differentiation between right and left in terms of how they want to deal with this. So what we'd have to do is talk about, you have these rules, but they become increasingly more flexible. The European semester becomes an exercise in coordination, talking about what would be useful in order to generate growth, in order to produce investment, but at the same time it would be at the national level where where governments would decide, where you'd have national election campaigns on the basis of a left saying we want more expansion and a right saying, well, we don't think we can do quite as much. Have them elected, have them win or lose, but doing that, you essentially, the extremes on the right and the left no longer have the wind in their sails, because you're actually seeing a differentiation in right and left. You actually see member states having responsibility for their policies. If you think I said it's policy without politics at the national level, politics without policy at the national level, you have to bring back policy to the national level, in particular in terms of economic policy.
Very well. Unfortunately, we can't go on, and we have to give the floor to the audience because we only have 10 minutes, and I would like the audience to be able to ask a few questions. I will ask you please to do very, very short questions so that many people can have the chance to ask as well.
First, good afternoon, and you said yourself, Professor, that you might be brutal. I guess I will be brutal also. Because the issue is, first of all, I'm a politician, and I don't feel comfortable when people go to such conferences and speak out against politicians. I think it's not a very democratic way to handle these very complex issues. Then, you talked about England. Well, a few friends of mine came yesterday from London, and I asked them, how was it? And they said, well, sad. It's stopping by the minute. Then about German...
Stopping.
What? Well, it's by the minute. It's stopping, because no one knows how to handle that very, very complex situation. About Germany, well, you are a very lucky guy, because you were born in a very rich and wealthy nation. And about Merkel, she is so moderate that by this time a fascist party is rising to the first 13 or 15%. Because she has a good policy towards the refugees, and by the way, refugees flew to Germany and they just don't want to come to Portugal. None of them, because we are poor. And about the Union, I would like to say this. We are still a very, very poor country, but we were far, far even poorer before joining the Union. And I guess you just have no idea how poor we were. So I feel very
Madam, I'm
uncomfortable.
Sorry, could you please ask your question, because we have very, very limited time, please.
Well, my question is, don't you feel a little bit upset if you go to a very poor country saying that we just would be better if we just walk away from the Union?
Okay. Can I answer this?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Professor Streeck.
First of all, when I was born in 1946, I was born into a very, very poor country. just to and I could I could relate some of my childhood memories to you if you want. Secondly, my parents were also refugees, and I was born in a refugee camp, so I know something about refugees. More importantly, Brexit and the future of Portugal. I think the Brexit thing is a unique opportunity, and don't believe your middle-class friends from England. There is enough popular support in England to win that referendum again, I can assure you. Theresa May is a very smart politician. She knows that this is an irreversible decision. As far as the Brexit is concerned, I see an opportunity here. The opportunity is to negotiate a kind of flexible association between Britain and the rest of Europe, which could be a model for a flexible association of other countries as well, and which might also be attractive for countries that are now members. In other words, my principle, which underlay everything that I said, was the more integration you have in Europe today, the more division you get, because we have driven integration too far and we need some more flexibility. I agree with Vivien on this completely. In order to do that, it might be useful, if our politicians were smart enough, it would be useful to use the negotiations with Britain, which will take 2 years, to renegotiate the status of member, non-member, associate member, and so on. But I'm afraid they do not have the capacity to do this. As far as Portugal is concerned, and I think you have completely misunderstood what I said. I wish you all the best, but I think that in the European Monetary Union, you will get poorer and poorer rather than richer. And that is the heart essence of what I try to say. Because if you want to compete with the German export machine, I wish you good luck. Without having the capacity which traditionally nation states had to readjust their currency to the rest of the world economy in order to make up for their own lack of competitiveness when it comes to exports. You have given up this capacity and now you're suffering from it. My argument is you need to get it back. Now, talking about how this can happen, I may be allowed to spend 2 minutes on this. Before we introduced the euro, we had the so-called European Monetary System Roman II, where all European countries that went into the euro sort of joined that regime, which meant that each country was allowed to adjust their currency exchange rates only by 10% plus minus, and that the European Central Bank would give them all sorts of credit help in order to be able to do this. After 2 years, the currencies were aligned, as they say, forever. But there's one country left in the European monetary system too, which is Denmark, which in the last moment did not get into the euro. They were lucky. This is very, very good. This was a very smart decision. Now the Danes are still in this European monetary system too. If they want to readjust the relationship between their currency and the euro, they get financial, all sorts of support from the European monetary, from the European Central Bank. All I want is that a country like yours and other countries who are suffering under these rigid regimes can go back to the European monetary system, Roman II. It is complicated, it is risky, it demands an enormous amount of fine-tuning, but I can assure you it is easier than getting rich and prosperous inside the European monetary system, because that is impossible.
I think we have time for one more question, and it could be a short question, and if possible, to Professor Vivien Schmidt, please. One more question?
Yeah, I was going to address Vivien, actually. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the metaphor you pose about the train going towards the station. And I mean, for me, it's it's the image we always have, but in my mind I always think, where is the station? How can we know if the train is too big and too strong? Maybe he has already hit the station. There is a lot of health systems that are falling apart. In Greece or even here in Portugal, people are not having access to these services anymore. Maybe we don't even feel if we are inside the train. We hit one station and there will be another one, and we're not going to feel it. How do we measure the end point, you know what I mean? What are the metrics to realize we get there? Where is the end of the tunnel?
I think the only answer is to change the metaphor. Because it's one where it looks as if the only way you can go is into another station. I think you make a very important points about problems of growing inequalities, growing poverty. A humanitarian crisis is what Caritas and the Council for Europe have called what has happened as a result of the austerity and structural reforms that we've seen, in particular in Southern Europe, but also Ireland, and actually even in Germany. You see increasing dualization of the workforce, increasing pauperization for lots of people doing many jobs, etc. So how do we work this out? And I think if one could do an EMS2, great. My idea about increasing flexibility in the Eurozone, where one would adjust, one would essentially empty the rules of their neoliberal substance and let countries decide for themselves. All of that would be tremendously important. But we need to think slightly larger, which is, not the train to the station, but what is the finalité of Europe? Where does it go in the future? How do we think about it? So a more flexible Eurozone, but also more flexible membership across the various areas. Instead of what the French have actually been proposing insanely, which is a hardcore Europe around Germany and France without recognizing that any kind of hardcore Europe would be a German Euro.
Insane, absolutely.
Totally insane. Instead of thinking about the future as a hardcore Europe, think about it as made up of overlapping policy communities, Euro, Schengen, security and defense, which we haven't talked about, which has different clusters of member states as part of it. So the overlap of all these different cluster of member states in different policy communities creates a kind of soft core membership, where most countries are involved together in something. Keep one set of institutions. Don't create a parliament for the euro or anything like that. One set of institutions where everyone has voice, but you have vote only in those policy areas in which you participate. In particular, if you're going to put budgetary resources, say, into a reinforced euro, then only those have vote. But it's tremendously important also to say, who has, in Schengen, for example, Switzerland, Norway are in, but they have no vote. It's a single market. Same thing. It's a disaster for their democracies. What you do is you say everyone who participates has voice, and those policy communities of which they're part, they have a vote. Therefore, everyone's sitting around the table. Everyone is talking to one another. I've used this metaphor before. It's like having a gourmet meal where everyone is sitting around the table, learning the kind of table manners and the kind of conversations you can have, i.e. more cooperative, even though there can be contestation, but that you're sitting around the table. Some of you will sit out a course or two. One won't want to be part of Schengen, another won't be part of Euro, but they're all talking to one another. It seems to me that that's the only way that you can imagine that Europe continuing to grow closer together, but at the same time, it's got to be individual member state choice as to which policy areas they want to be in. And then in each policy area, it has to be highly flexible. It cannot be these kinds of, especially for the euro, these kinds of rigid rules that simply don't work. Governing by rules, ruling by numbers doesn't work. But beyond that, lying about the fact that actually you're continuing to govern by rules, but you're giving so many derogations, recognize these rules don't work. You can keep them as general guidelines or goals, but give back to the member states responsibility over their own policies. And I think we'll all be in a better place.
Very well. Thank you very much. Just before ending this session, I would like to invite you to read Professors Vivien, Schmidt and Professor Wolfgang Streeck's books and articles. They're very interesting. Many, many ideas that they have written about. We haven't had the chance to talk today. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.